A scratch, a hiss, and finally, a flare to life. This is the sound of fire in your hands. Fire making is one of humanity's oldest innovations, and yet it was only in the last 2 centuries that creating fire was easy as a flick of the wrist. Both watches and locomotives were invented before the coming of easy fire. What challenges would we have had to go through if we did not have fire on command? And how did light and heat eventually become easily available to all? This is the story of the matchstick. From its inception, making a fire from scratch is a time-consuming and likely laborious task, heavily dependent on the weather around you and the materials at hand. Fire cannot be sparked from a lens if there is no sunlight, and the wetness and type of wood you have available will dramatically affect the time it takes to create a friction fire from a bow or a drill. Pliny the Elder describes the striking of flint and steel to create sparks as among the earliest fire-starting inventions, but those sparks had to have something suitable to land on were the fire to take. It is here our story starts. 2 simultaneous innovations on opposite ends of the world occurred when, in Rome and China, it was discovered that sulfur ignited easier than plain wood. Small splints of wood, soaked in sulfur, ignite at about 150 degrees centigrade, about half the temperature of the most suitable wood. These small sulfur sticks could then be used to light lamps or serve as easier starters for camps and stoves. Though an innovation to be sure, this process served more as a refinement to the existing flint and steel process than something entirely new. But something entirely new was a long time in coming. The times of the Romans and the Han Chinese had been over for more than a millennia before something changed. Eyeglasses, the printing press, telescopes, pencils, watches, microscopes, and classical music had all been invented by the light lit the same way it always had been, struck afresh by friction or lens, or taken from an existing fire. If you fancy to smoke at an inn during the time of Da Vinci or Mozart, you would sit down in front of the fireplace and use a piece of straw or rope to take the flame to your pipe. You just had to hope that the fireplace was lit. Indeed, the word match at this time was only used in reference to the treated piece of slow-burning thin rope lit by musketeers before battle to fire their guns, and not a quick-burning, self-igniting piece of wood. Even the mighty steam locomotive, the definitive invention that started the industrial age, predated readily available fire starting. In 1825, 10 years after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, the first practical steam locomotive, the Locomotion No. 1, almost failed in one of its debuts because they had forgotten to bring a source of fire. They couldn't light the engine. Just as a man was about to be dispatched to the nearby town for a lamp, a navvy came forth and offered a piece of glass that he used to light his pipe via the sun. The coal within the boiler was then successfully lit, and the first passenger rail service was on its way, sparked off in a manner that would have been familiar to the Romans. Firemaking was simply a field we had not yet come far. The first signs of change proved sporadic, unreliable, and dangerous, but they were changes nevertheless. The first self-contained fire-making devices did not rely on friction at all. Rather, they used reactive chemicals. Throughout the 1770s to circa the 1830s, various mixtures were experimented with by inventors all over Europe. The basic tenet of all these would be that a splint of wood could be impregnated in some solution, and then exposed to a separate chemical that would ignite it. Generally, if you were to buy one of these chemical kits, you would take your splint and dip it in a separate glass vial of chemicals, whereupon it would ignite. Jean Chancel of France developed a product in 1805 that was essentially a modern matchbox made of metal, containing a chemical solution in one compartment and another compartment full of wooden splints. To ignite a splint, it simply had to be dipped and removed from the acid reservoir. Unfortunately, it was quite common for the acid to leak out and damage your clothing or nearby upholstery, or perhaps even explode in your pocket. Refinements made this product safer, but it was always expensive and never really caught on. The chemical fire starter that would likely be more familiar to us today was developed by Samuel Jones of England in 1828. Named the Promethean match, these devices look somewhat similar to a modern cigarette, with a splint of wood wrapped in paper, on the end of which was a glass bead containing the reactive chemical. To use, you would simply break the end containing the glass with a pair of pliers, or even your own teeth, and then the splint would ignite. Of course, with a small glass bead being all what was saving your pants or skirt from bursting into flames, there was an understandable aversion to the danger involved. To the end of this line of chemical-based thinking was a novelty introduced by an American named John Merrick, who, in 1834, skipped the middleman and simply added the fire-starting material directly to the end of a cigar, which he sold as the self-igniting cigar. Things were beginning to change, though, and experiments with friction-based systems were already underway. The element that would change the game would be phosphorus. First isolated in 1669 by an alchemist who was seeking to turn silver into gold, phosphorus was found to be incredibly flammable. It was even named after the Greek for light bearer, for the fire it easily produced. Early experiments with using them as a practical fire starter look similar to other chemical experiments revolving around a flask of phosphorus in which a sulfur splint was stuck. But by the 1830s, manufacturers across Europe were beginning to use a mixture of phosphorus that was stable enough to dry under the end of a splint of wood that could be ignited by friction. These were beginning to look like what we might see as a modern matchstick. Things began to move more quickly now. Matchsticks of various configurations began to come out with names such as Congreves, named after the inventor of the rockets used by the British Army, and Lucifers, slang that stuck around in English to the 20th century and is still the name for matches in Dutch and Flemish. If you were to strike a match from 1840, problems you'd probably notice compared to today's matches were the much more violent initial flare-up, the flame being less steady, and the unpleasant odor of sulfur. Some lucifers would send sparks flying quite far from the box, and others would drop flaming globs on ground and carpet. Oh, and they were highly poisonous. Phosphorus is a toxic substance, and there's enough in a matchbox to kill a person. Despite the glamour of cyanide and its bitter almonds being a staple poison of 19th century mysteries, it was actually phosphorus that many people used to commit suicide, a common method being to bite off the heads of matches. And it was these poison fumes that people inhaled every time they struck a match. This poisonous problem remained for much of the century. It wasn't until the Austrian scientist Anton Schroeter von Christelli discovered that phosphorus could be refined into an inert form that did not produce fumes upon ignition. Ever wonder why match heads are red? It is because this safer phosphorus turns red after refining, and it's what coats the match. Unrefined phosphorus is white, which is what gave old match heads a white color. It seemed like portable fire could finally be both reliable and safe. But despite von Christelli's discovery of red phosphorus in 1850, and its widespread announcement at the Crystal Palace in 1851, manufacturers would continue to use the deadly white phosphorus for another half-century. Reasons included white phosphorus being cheaper to produce and providing a somewhat more energetic flame, but the non-financial costs were great. Manufacturers of matches, those actually dipping the splints in the chemical mixture, were exposed to dangerous doses of phosphorus. Remember, a single box is poisonous enough to kill you. These matchmakers, primarily young women, were at risk of developing phossy jaw, an affliction where the jawbone begins to decompose due to phosphorus fumes. This affliction was well documented at the time, and interesting enough, the disease only occurs in those with bad teeth, as it is through cavities that the phosphorus vapor is taken in. Industrialists actually offered free dental care and routine inspections in an attempt to protect their workers, but the fact remained that many workers still suffered from working with poison. Finally, European countries began to ban the use of white phosphorus matches, starting with Finland in 1874 and ending with the United Kingdom in 1910. The United States, like with most vices today, was unable to stomach an outright ban on a substance people used to kill themselves. Instead, just slapped a tax on it. But at last, in most places at least, fire could be made safely. As safe as fire is, anyway. Today, Matches have in many areas been largely replaced by self-contained lighters. Ironically, these are also another long descendant of an apparatus once used by musketeers to fire their guns. The spinning wheel that sparks and ignites the fuel within a standard lighter uses the same principle as an action on a wheel-lock pistol, developed in 1500. Still though, matches remain the dominant source of ready fire throughout much of the world, and has spawned a delightful hobby known as Phillumeny, the collecting of matchboxes and matchbooks for their fabulous art, any of which will still give you that satisfying scratch and a hiss. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. This week's video was prompted by a comment from one of you who, after last week's ice video, naturally wanted to see something on fire. So, shoutouts to Ching China 1. If any of you have any other ideas for future videos or topics you'd like to know more about the history of, please let me know down below, and I'll happily consider them. Or, perhaps I've already done it. We've covered a wide variety of topics. Either way, I hope you found this history illuminating, and have a great day.